I do believe that this is an opportunity to rethink the narratives. For developing nations, I think one of the big things will be about doing green not because the US government is telling them to, or because the German developing agency is financing investments to do green hydrogen, but to see green as something that truly aligns in their own visions of development.
A lot's happening in the world, particularly around industrial policy, tariffs, the kind of Trump versus China showdown, all of it. So I want to dive right in, but just quickly, you're a development economist. And just for the benefit of all of us, could you just briefly kind of explain to us what development economics really is?
Development economics is the discipline that essentially tries to understand the reasons behind prosperity in both developed and developing nations, right? So there is a big bulk of development economics which is worried about poverty alleviation, right, in the world's poor countries. But it's not just the poor countries that are affected, right? Because there are pockets of poverty everywhere, right? So development economics in many ways also applies to rich countries where you have areas, where income levels and well-being standards are quite low. So this is the kind of bulk of the discipline.
Your first book, congratulations. I have it
Thanks.
right here, just conveniently. It's called Survival of the Greenest. And I think the takeaway that I had from it was almost a kind of warning that you issue, that the way that we're sort of currently going about trying to tackle climate change, trying to decarbonize, is actually right now kind of risking not only sort of cementing, but actually exacerbating inequalities in the global economy. So I'd love if you could just unpack for us, why you think that's such a significant risk, and what is it about the nature of kind of lower income or developing economies that makes them so much more, I guess, at risk from both this crisis and attempts to resolve it.
So basically, we've learned nothing from COVID. Right?
Okay.
And the idea that our planet's well-being is only as strong as the weakest members of society or the most vulnerable members of society. And, I've started working on green industrial policy about 8-9 years ago with Gwendalina Anzolin. And we had expected the kind of green renaissance of industrial policy, but mostly through the recognition that market forces are not enough, right, to deal with climate change, and you need stronger state intervention. This has happened, but not for the same motivations that we are wrong about, right? Industrial policy has made a big comeback, but not so much for climatic reasons, but more to capture a kind of the perception of or to capture a global market opportunity. Right, so it's mostly trade interests that are trumping ecological interests when it comes to green industrial policy or the practice of green industrial policy in the last 5 years. And this is quite problematic, right? Because the way green industrial policy is being implemented is actually pushing the poorest communities further behind, both in terms of inequalities within countries, right, where you see a lot of the practices about tax handouts to large corporations, and they're loving the green industrial policy as it is, but it's not necessarily helping workers, but also between countries. So the great Hadjun Chang had written this book almost 30 years ago.
Oh, he's so ahead of his time.
On kicking away the ladder. So we're seeing the same process with kicking away the green ladder, where the poorest nations are not as well equipped, right, to join the green industrialization race. And in fact, they're facing several punishments because they're more exposed they're facing a triple punishment. They're more exposed to climate and transition risks, right? Because they're more dependent on activities like agriculture, which are more vulnerable to fluctuations in precipitation and temperature. But then credit rating agencies are increasingly taking into account those risks when designing or when coming up with country credit scores, right? Okay. So the perceptions of exposure to climate risks is increasing costs of borrowing for these countries that are already fiscally stressed.
So credit scores are affecting the sort of cost of borrowing, and there's just a few agencies that are sort of setting what those costs are, basically.
That's right. So if there is a big hurricane, right, in the Bahamas, induced by climate change, or great rating agencies might think that this is becoming more and more frequent, so you know what, it will become more expensive, right? Or the cost of borrowing for the government of the Bahamas will be higher.
Good.
And the third punishment, exactly, and the third punishment is that these countries are even pushed away from the green windows of opportunities that arise from global decarbonization, right? All the industrial opportunities, all the trade opportunities, all the investment, because they're concentrated in a handful of already industrialized nations that, want to win this green industrialization race.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned there around, I guess, the fact that these are, in many cases, non-renewable resources. A lot of sort of lower income economies around the world, they are built often around the extraction of particular resources, the kind of raw materials that then feed into the more sort of developed economies of somewhere like the US or Europe or Canada. And is there a risk of this kind of zero-sum game where at the end of the day, if what you're trying to do is move into, say, producing like green technologies, so batteries or renewables or any of the things that we might need, ultimately there's also kind of increasing dependence through that on these very same supply chains that are sort of creating these path dependencies. So how do you sort of see, is that, inherently in tension, and is there a kind of resolution to that?
Yeah, so in fact, it's a double-edged sword to have this kind of endowment in the natural resources that you need for the green transition. The issue that I see is that many developing countries are seeing their resource endowment, whether it's lithium or cobalt or graphene, right, as a entry door, right, to join those new green energy supply chains. But again, going back to history, we have a lot to learn. And now everyone's talking about critical minerals, right? Yeah. But something that we often forget is it's not, criticality is is very time and space specific. And what's critical today might not be critical tomorrow, right? And right now you need those minerals. You need cobalt and lithium to produce an electric battery. But there's a lot of R&D to develop batteries that don't use any of those minerals, right? That use other types of materials. And we're still at the height of the learning curve for green technological innovation. So we should be expecting technologies to change. And as they change, countries that were dependent or they were stuck as just, providers of raw materials will be left with the short end of the stick. And this has happened in the past, unfortunately. Chile used to be a big exporter of natural nitrate, right? That was the main export of Chile in the 30s. Then a German scientist, Fritz Haber, figured out how to synthesize nitrate. And basically, from one day to the next, the Chilean economy, went into a bust, just producing a material that can be easily substituted into something else. What you really want is capabilities, right? Capabilities to do other things or to do a range of things so that your economy or the eggs of your economy are not all in the same basket. So in many ways, it's the policy tools that these countries will use that is really critical and not the minerals that they have.
I want to talk about those policy tools. And I think, the case of Chile is really interesting, that you bring it up there insofar as I think it captures something that you explore really clearly in your book and something that we've actually talked about a little bit on previous episodes. I'm thinking about a conversation both with Andres Arauz and with Katarina Pistor and probably with Ha-Jun Chang when he was on one of our earliest episodes, which is thinking about the IMF, the kind of International Monetary Fund, this kind of global lender, and the fact that, it prescribes often attached to the loans that it gives to countries that need them, very specific kinds of policies that I'd love if you could kind of walk through for us, maybe sort of summarize. And which are sort of seen as this kind of silver bullet for how you become a kind of developed, modernized, rich economy. But in practice have sort of often done the opposite. And so could you just kind of walk through, I guess, what those are, and maybe explain to me, because I've always, genuinely wondered this, which is that, if these are policies that continue to kind of have harmful effects, how has this kind of like consensus and approach been maintained?
That's a very good question. But you're right in many ways that historically, and to some extent until today, the IMF has been prescribing minimal state interventions in developing countries, slashing down, or fiscal austerity to slash down, public expenditures. But there are a couple of things to say here. It's true, this strategy has not worked. And in many ways, it's kind of, to go back to Hadun Cheng's metaphor, it's pulling up the ladder, right, that countries normally use, right, to achieve economic development. That said, not to be, or maybe to be the devil's advocate, we often blame the IMF for, these kind of disasters. But the IMF is often brought down in situations where there's already a debt distress, right? And in some cases, the IMF is brought down in situations where the government wants to achieve or wants to promote fiscal austerity, but they don't have a political way to justify it, right? So the IMF is just there to play, the bad guys. But you're right that ideologically there is an issue in terms of the promotion of ideas that can actually help achieve economic development. Now, a lot of things have changed since the 80s. It has become more and more obvious, especially in the last 4 years, that industrial policy is not only making a comeback, but it's working for some countries, right? Not least China. Now, the interesting thing is, the IMF is also not a monolithic place, right? There is a lot of economists that are thinking different things. Some of them have produced for a long time reports on the return of the policy that shall not be named, Reda Sharif and Fuad Hasanov. But the official IMF line has been that, okay, industrial policy might work in some contexts, right? But it can really work in those countries that have the right governance for it, whatever that means. And those countries are the USA and China. But if you're any other country, don't play with it, you're going to hurt yourself, right? And that's a very wrong narrative, because the idea is actually how to help countries, right, learn how to use those policy tools, right, or how to make them more effective. And this is where I think that sports analogies are very useful, because we're somehow expecting, in many sports, including football and other team sports, you need a head coach, right? You would never conceive that you're sending your team to play in international competition, right? And it's just the players by themselves and they'll just figure it out naturally on the pitch. But this is where industrial policy comes in, because the idea is this is a way for the state not to necessarily play the role of the referee only, right? Where you set the rules of the game and you just enforce them, nor be the team captain that has to be on the pitch all the time and that has to also score all the goals and, be the main player. But it's actually the most important role for the state is on the bench or on the sidelines as a head coach, where it sets the vision, the long-term strategy, the kind of training capabilities that increases the chemistry between the players, that increases the competitiveness of the whole team, right? And so in a way, the coach is one of the most important player of the sports, or AKA the economy. And this is and the idea is, if you're losing game, it's okay to lose some games, right? But the idea is to learn this kind of skills that make you more competitive on the long term.
You mentioned an important word there, I think, for the conversation that we're going to have, which is not even a word, a phrase, industrial policy. And so just for the benefit of all of us, what exactly does that mean, and why is it so important to the current context?
So industrial policy is essentially the strategic effort by the government to reorient investments towards critical areas, right, as a way to change the structure of the economy away from low value added activities towards higher value added activities. That's the kind of technical definition that has a consensus with most people. But, in other words, that's when governments just don't want to leave the direction of the economy to market forces alone, right? And it doesn't have to be going against the market, but it's really thinking about how to tame the market to achieve results, right, that are socially optimal, right, to increase the resilience of an economy, to create more jobs, to balance regional inequalities, or achieving other goals, right, that strengthens society as a whole.
So can you walk us through the example historically, I guess, of Chile and its kind of development model? Because you've written a very interesting piece on how it kind of encapsulates that disconnect that you're describing around the fact that, industrial policy, the ability to kind of leverage the power of the state to deliver the kind of ends you want to see, that's been sort of cordoned off for kind of rich countries and denied from others. And Chile is often used as an example of where kind of free market policies have been so successful. But you've written about why reality is like quite different to that. So I'd love if you could kind of just unpack that example for us and sort of the lessons that it teaches us.
Yeah, so Chile is a case where they've pretended that they didn't have a head coach, but he was, hiding in the lockers. Because as you said, it's often been portrayed as a free market miracle, and which is what prompted me to study Chile in the first place. This could not be further away from the truth. Because if you look at Chile's economic development in details, all of the sectors that successfully emerged in Chile's export basket, right, that became globally competitive, have benefited in one way or another from state interventions and industrial policies, right? But interestingly, very often in disguise. So, and a lot of it happened during the seemingly free market-oriented Pinochet dictatorship, right? So they would not say that they were intervening in a sector, but they had some very aggressive interventions. To give you a few examples, in the forestry sector, the central bank directly manipulated prices so that, to incentivize investments to process, wood into value-added products. The central bank even identified the type of pines that should be planted in Chile, right? And that represented a market opportunity. And many other sectors benefited from state interventions. But the other side of the story is that a lot of these industries were infant industries. So it took, 2-3 decades to kind of come to friction. And then it did during the Pinochet regime. So the devil is really in the details. And in fact, what we also learned from Chile is that the free market dictatorship, their free market policies led to a deep economic crisis in several installments. But when they got into trouble is when they resorted to state interventions, right? Which is something that we're seeing in the US today as well. That they've been promoting free market economics, for decades. But when the US realized that, when the US government realized it was really late to the green industrialization game, right? And China was kind of moving far ahead. This is when they brought, the big tools, aka industrial policy, to catch up. So this is kind of logic of industrial policy. It's not against market forces, but it's a way to make sure that those forces are reoriented and redirected towards achieving the outcomes that you want, but also at the pace that you need.
I want to come back to the US example and spend some time there. But first, I want to pick up on someone else you mentioned, which is China. I think, it's impossible to kind of have a conversation about the climate without someone mentioning China. And, for good reason. I think depending on who you are, it's either kind of the hero or the villain of the story. And, increasingly relevant as the kind of superpower of particularly, green technology, thinking about the fact that they're driving, the vast majority of like renewable investment and build out around the world, kind of single-handedly keeping that industry alive. But I want to start with a slightly more historical view on China. And I think just on these questions about sort of like models of development and the way that we sort of understand a kind of very straightforward like free market capitalism as being what, you know, unleashed the US to be what it is, etc. When often, as you point out, you know, the story is a lot more complicated. So how did China come to be China?
How long do we have?
I know.
It's
Well,
like
yeah, look, strap in, everybody.
Yeah. So, no, China is a fascinating case. And in many ways, it's one of the most spectacular contemporary cases of economic development, right? In many respects. And there are many things to say about China. Perhaps the three most important ones are that there's a lot to learn from China, right? Even though their kind of institutional conditions are quite different from the rest of the world. One of the greatest, in my opinion, one of the greatest lessons from the Chinese model doesn't have much to do with the policy tools that they've used, with the way they've introduced industrial policy, but with something very specific, which is their ability to adapt and adjust to the changing conditions, but also to what works. So it's a very Darwinian take, you know. But one of the greatest lessons from China, in my opinion, is the fact that they went as far as just restructuring, you know, how the government works, or even creating and eliminating ministries to facilitate coordination between different entities, right? And based on what works, what doesn't work. They went as far as completely dismantling the Ministry of Energy in 2013 because they realized, not because they don't believe in energy, but actually they realized that energy is a cross-ministerial issue, right? So every ministry should be involved in discussions on energy policy. So instead they have a National Energy Commission, right, which is a cross-ministerial commission. How many governments do you know that are able to kind of assess what works, what doesn't work, and think, okay, so let's just try this out, see what works, you know, and if not, we'll just revert back, right? Many governments are stuck in a kind of institutional rigidity where they then go for second, third, fourth best, you know, solution based on what they have. And so to go back to another sports analogy, I often say that we need a curling approach to green industrial policy rather than bowling. Curling is arguably not a very popular sport, but you're Canadian.
Hey, yeah.
So, you know, that might ring a bell.
It's my culture.
And the thing with curling is, you know, with bowling, you just throw the ball and you hope that it's going to reach the target down the line, right? With curling, you don't really leave it that much to chance because you have those people, I don't know how you would call it, but they're using a broom. Yeah. So they're kind of like adjusting the trajectory of the disc, right? And I think this is exactly what industrial policy has been missing over time. You're putting out a strategy, you're hoping that 10, 20, 30 years down the line is going to hit the target. But market conditions change. Technology gets disrupted. Regulations and policies get, you know, completely transformed, as we're seeing now with the Trump administration. So that is the way in which I think the Chinese experience is really relevant, right? To show the ability to adjust and correct the trajectory over time. The second aspect is on the climate agenda. Of course, there are still a lot of things that can be criticized, especially in terms of reliance on coal as a source of energy. But what China is doing in terms of not only the deployment of renewables at home, but also in terms of making renewable energy technology cheaper worldwide is truly incredible, right? So if any other country was achieving the same outcomes, they would be praised as as a climate leader. Yeah. And that leads to my third point, which is that because of the first 2 points, the dialogue with China is not just useful or desirable, but it's essential if we're really serious about fighting climate change, right? They have a lot of technology to bring to the table. And so in a way, we should talk a lot more about development cooperation and technology transfer from China, especially low carbon technology, right, towards low middle income countries. but it's also about, partnering with China in terms of, achieving that thing that is a civilizational challenge, right? I think it's become clear that you can't solve this unless you bring everyone together. And in a multipolar world, when one of the great powers is, missing at the table, you kind of have to rely on the other. So the discourse around China is quite problematic, right? Because it's often framed as a way that, and when you hear a lot of governments, European governments, North American ones, it's also about slowing down China.
Yeah.
Rather than actually helping China speed up its process towards areas that are, globally desirable.
What's been strange to watch is yet another kind of version of some of the policy toolkit of industrial policy. I'm thinking in this case of tariffs, again, being used for kind of radically different ends. I guess, this is slightly sidetracked from the climate question, but I'm interested to know how you understand how President Trump is like using this tool, and what his aims are. And, maybe it's a blunt instrument, but how do you understand, there's been a lot of commentary on, this is just crazy. It has no kind of clear unifying agenda. He's just kind of throwing things around. But then equally, lots of other people say this is some kind of long-term grand master plan. So I'd be interested to know, how do you understand, the purpose of those tools in this context, and what do you see as the kind of vision of this project, if any?
Mm-hmm. I wish I was in Trump's head, but I don't know what his intentions are. One interpretation is that this is a form of industrial policy, different than Biden's, more aggressive than Biden's and less green, intended to bring back investments and manufacturing into the US. If that is the intention, then it's doomed to fail miserably, right? Because those tariffs don't quite guarantee success, but they're not the most effective way for the US government to actually promote investments back home. The second interpretation, which is closer to mine, is that this has not much to do with, it's more to do with the kind of geopolitics and influence than, the domestic prosperity agenda. Right, so I think that what Trump is doing is breaking the lines of the game, trying to reassert U.S. influence on different countries. And in that sense, I think that he's a bit more successful, right? And I think that his intention is to, his intention might be to kind of try to redesign a world order where the US is a lot more bullish about its intentions, which I don't think is necessarily a terrible thing for the rest of the world, because, there is a kind of assumption in many development circles that those countries are there, they have your back, right? That they're there to support you in your development journey. And the most dangerous manifestation of it are governments that do have those trade interests, but that are very skillful at, packaging it, otherwise. And that kind of like brutal, how to say, I wouldn't say honesty, but that kind of brutal realization that the US has no other interest than its own, at least helps to change the discourse in many developing nations to really and put agency, right, or bring more agency to the government's hands, right? And many governments are realizing that they can't just be on the passenger seat, right, following market forces or where demand or regulations in the US, and hoping that it aligns with the development agenda, but they have to be move to the driver's seat to really think about where do they want to be in the world. The third interpretation is perhaps a mix of both, in which what the Trump administration would want to do is just to slow down China, right? And I think they seems to be a lot more this seems to be a more, I'd say, reasonable or a more convincing explanations of recent events, where essentially it's just about slowing down China's, seemingly unstoppable rise, right? In terms of technological dominance, in terms of market capture, and in terms of general kind of weight in the international economy. And in that sense, again, I'm not sure how successful that will be, because we're already seeing a lot of reorganization of supply chains, or again, something that the Trump administration might not be, where they might be underestimating China, is what I was saying earlier, their ability to adapt and adjust to changing circumstances, right? So we're already seeing them adjusting in different ways, or investing in kind of, proxy countries that have preferential access to the US. So whichever of those three is actually the real motivation and behind the administration's actions, it's hard to say. But the disruptions that this causes, and the amount of pain as well for many populations across the world, does not mean that this is all bad for global development, right? Because as the lines of the game get broken, it also offers an opportunity for developing nations to rethink their development strategies and take a bit more kind of responsibility for their own strategy, right? And their own industrial policy, rather than kind of blaming the culprit, or assuming that free market economics is the reason why they cannot intervene in their country.
I think that was actually the question I kind of wanted to ask, which is, what do you think in terms of the kind of global effort to, I won't use the word decarbonize because you don't like it, but to move away from fossil fuels, to kind of build green infrastructures, all of those great things. Is the outcome of this in terms of these kind of the tariffs, the kind of rolling back of a lot of what Biden tried to do in terms of bringing like green manufacturing to the US, is the outcome of all of this rolling back that, this global effort to transition off fossil fuels to build green tech, it is completely destabilized by this sort of massive trauma? Or do you think it's more likely that this is just kind of like an own goal, to use your sports metaphors, and that what happens is, inadvertently or otherwise, we end up with a major shift, I guess, in the global economy in terms of who's actually like at the helm of this transition, and the US just kind of has shot itself in the foot and will kind of fall behind?
So it's an own goal, but it's also reducing the competitiveness of the other teams in a way. So it's bad news for everyone in many ways. And to continue with your, with that sport analogy, the issue with this kind of state interventions when it comes to the green agenda is, you can have two types of interventions. One using kind of athletics. One would be to put hurdles in the competitors' lanes, right? Which is what the US use of tariffs recently is really about, right? They just want to delay everyone else. As you hinted, they're not interested in moving faster, but they just want to slow down the others, and no one benefits from that. The climate agenda does not benefit. The development agenda does not benefit. There's another way, which is to kind of equip yourselves with speed-enhancing shoes, right? And the idea is that everyone's running. You just want to be running faster, right? Rather than wanting the others to just run slower. And so on that side, I think the green agenda is going to be suffering in the next few years. This is the bad news. But at the same time, I don't know if I'm being too naive or optimistic, but I do believe that this is an opportunity to rethink the narratives, to reshape the rules of the game, right? And for developing nations, I think one of the big thing will be about to think about, doing green not because the US government is telling them to, or because the German developing agency is just, offering, financing and investments to do green hydrogen, or because of the COP, national determined contributions that their previous governments gave. But to see green as something that truly aligns in their own visions of development, which can be for many different reasons, right? Some countries go green because they suffer from massive air pollution, which has health effects, right? And causes respiratory problems, which is one of the reasons why China also went so big on deploying renewables, because, air pollution in Beijing was through the roof. Some countries might do it because they perceive it as a trade interest, right? So they have a lot of lithium, and they think that they want to be producing electric batteries, or which is kind of what Biden had been doing. Some other countries see it from a kind of macroeconomic resilience, calculus. So countries like the Sultanate of Oman, they're running out of oil faster than everyone else. So they're going really big on renewables as a way to maintain their energy security, right? Not because necessarily of a deep love for the planet, but that's because it's also aligns with their energy interests. And some countries, but the list is very short, might do it out of a genuine, commitment to nature. The only country I can really think about is perhaps Costa Rica, right? But you can see that even in Costa Rica, this has brought a lot of economic benefits. This is a country that runs on 100% renewables in the electricity matrix. And they've used this as an attractive argument to bring investments in energy-intensive technology services and manufacturing that could be, I'll use the word decarbonized, as soon as they just, plug into the national grid, right? So there are many ways in which countries can adopt the kind of green development agenda, but it has to come from within. And so the biggest enemy or the biggest barrier is when, outsiders are already in control of the narrative, are not letting them develop this agency. But when you have a situation like today, it really forces countries to have a deep thinking about, where their priorities lie, right? Or where they want to be.
So I think when we talk about green development, or even just kind of the green agenda, as it were, around the world, we kind of almost always are thinking, and I'm very guilty of this, about a very specific kind of industrial policy, a very specific kind of economic activity, which is basically, like building solar panels or batteries or EVs, these kind of very techy goods, that high-tech goods that, countries like the US or China really focus on producing. But in a way, not everyone can do that, because if everyone around the world was just sort of following this exact same kind of economic pattern, then it just, things would fall apart. So, are there other ways to think about this question of development, but also in the context of wanting to do it in a green way, than just saying, we're going to try and outcompete the US on, EVs? Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually a big challenge is to redefine what green industrial policy means in different contexts and with different starting points. And you're right that an issue is that everybody seems to think that it's about producing solar panels and wind turbines, right? But it can be, and it has to be, so much more. And in fact, one of the issues is with the green part of green industrial policy that has been almost exclusively defined in terms of carbon emissions, right? And the challenge of decarbonization. But there are many other ecological goals that we're facing, right? Things like biodiversity loss, things like material pollution and waste, for example, plastic pollutions in oceans, overuse of renewable resources like water. So if you have a green industrial policy that only addresses emissions but makes the other things worse, can you really call it a green industrial policy? And if you're a biodiverse area, you're not going to destroy your forestry to put a solar panel factory and, call it, green industrialization, because that's neither sustainable nor development. And that's why if you're, for example, a biodiverse nation, your biodiversity, and that links to, some of your work, has, of course, an ecological value that is intangible, but that biodiversity also has huge value, a huge innovation value, right? As a bank of ideas for technological innovation. And that's something that can be leveraged through biomimicry, which is one of my kind of academic hobbies, and help by the rest countries kind of enter the green economy from a position where they're innovators, right, and they're technology providers as opposed to technology consumers, while protecting their natural asset. If you are a fossil fuel producing nation, your green industrial policy might look very different, right? Because your challenge is extremely different. But Adrienne, many people assume, or many fossil fuel producing countries see themselves as the losers of energy transition, but they don't have to be, because fossil fuel producing nations have often accumulated frontier capabilities in energy systems, in technologies, infrastructure that are needed, right, to produce fossil fuels, but that can be also needed to produce low carbon technologies, right? Think about all the chemical engineers that you have in fossil fuel producing areas. And in some developing countries, these are often the only types of frontier skills and capabilities they have. So those assets can be used as not to reinvent or not to start from scratch when you address energy transition, but they can be used to gain a head start in the energy transition. So their green industrial policy will look very different from some other nations. And in fact, it's really essential that countries think deeply about what it means for them. Otherwise, they risk producing the type of goods that the incumbents are making it very hard, right, for others to do the same goods, right, through tariffs, environmental regulations, and other means.
And you used a word there, biomimicry. Could you just unpack what you mean by that?
So biomimicry is the process of learning from nature, right? By emulating forms, processes, ecosystems that are found in the environment, right, in different species, and use it for improving human design and engineering. And this is something that most people don't often hear from. No. But this is the most natural thing to do, especially for sustainability innovation. Because think about it, nature has 3.4 billion years of R&D ahead of us, right? And is doing things in a much more sustainable way than humans. So we have a lot to learn from nature. And in fact, humans have sought inspiration from nature ever since prehistory, right? As a natural thing. Humans imitate what they see. So prehistoric humans were actually, spears. They were shaping spears based on the shapes of animal teeth. Wind turbines, the most efficient wind turbines, the blades are actually shaped after humpback whales' fins, right? Because, to go back to your whales again, because of the drag and the kind of, aerodynamics of the shape of those fins. But for energy storage, for my colleagues think that I speak too much of beetles and bugs, but think about electric eels, volcanic beetles. These are things that not only kind of attract, and store electricity, but some of those species are able to adapt their body temperature, with the kind of chemical reactions in their body. So imagine if we were able to leverage this to replace air conditioning, which is a major source of emissions. So there's a lot to learn from nature, and green industrial policy could be a way, right, to speed up that process, because as Leonardo da Vinci said, learn from nature, this is where our future lies.
I actually think that's a really great place to leave it, and an almost positive note to leave it on, which is rare for this podcast. But thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
No, thank you, Adrienne. It was a fun conversation.